All right, today you're going to take a look at Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy. And if there was ever anyone that was more strikingly different than Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson would be the man. Just a quick review. You'll remember that Teddy Roosevelt was really, for the most part, the first president of the 20th century. He was dubbed the first modern president. And when it came to foreign policy, Teddy Roosevelt, of course, initiated what was called the Big Stick diplomacy, using intimidation and force, specifically the Great White Fleet, the big modern navy that he had constructed under the inspiration of Alfred Thayer Mahan's writings. Roosevelt had really made no apologies for the fact that he felt it was America's duty and obligation to not just adhere to the Monroe Doctrine of the 1820s, but also put some teeth into it, hence the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. It has been said that Teddy Roosevelt loved war. In fact, he once made a comment after his Rough Rider experience in the Spanish-American War that he had never felt something more exhilarating than being shot at with no effect. I can think of a lot of things I'd rather do than get shot at, but for Teddy Roosevelt, that was living on the edge. Well, beyond the scope of William Howard Taft's intercession between these two men, along will come Woodrow Wilson, who, interestingly enough, will get the White House in large part because of Teddy Roosevelt's insistence that he get it back from Taft, whom he had in many ways anointed as his successor. You might recall that Taft was tapped by Roosevelt, served admirably, but not progressively enough for Roosevelt. Roosevelt came back to the Republicans in 1912, said, "I want to be the president again." They said, "We're sticking with the incumbent." He said, "Well, then I'll form my own party." Formed the Bull Moose Party, more oftentimes referred to as the Progressive Party, basically split the Republican vote in half and thereby gave the election to Wilson. Now, Wilson will come in to the White House with, as I mentioned a moment ago, a completely different foreign policy. Wilson was very much of an idealist and perhaps a borderline pacifist. Wilson saw the world through rose-colored glasses. Wilson saw the glasses half full, not half empty, and certainly not worth throwing at somebody. So Wilson will endeavor upon arrival in the White House to really, in many respects, part company with Teddy Roosevelt. Here's some examples of the way that he did this. I'd suggest you write some of this down. Where Roosevelt was an unabashed imperialist, you might recall his behavior with Colombia in order to dig the Panama Canal. It was that very canal that Wilson was able to show his anti-imperialist leanings. In fact, he repealed the Panama Canal Tolls Act, which was in 1912, which had exempted U.S. ships from paying tolls while going through the canal. He also passed the Jones Act in 1916, which would give the Philippines, as he said, soon their independence. That soon ended up being 1945, but at least he was indicating that the United States government was going to move in that direction, recognizing the injustice and the wrong that the United States had placed upon the Philippines during the Spanish-American War and the insurgent crisis that erupted afterwards. He also sent troops, though, to Haiti in 1915 to protect U.S. lives and property, not as a military intervention, but simply as a national security endeavor. Wilson, of course, like any president, though, will not be able to simply avoid all of the world's problems. The United States is not an island, although sometimes you would argue that we had spent most of our 19th century imagining that we were. What else was the Monroe Doctrine than stating to Europe, "This is our island, stay out"? But presidents, for example, such as George W. Bush, are oftentimes given crises that whether they wanted them or not, whether they campaigned on them or not, they're going to have to deal with them. And that was the case with Wilson. Right after he took office in 1913, our neighbors to the south, Mexico, erupted in a revolution. The president was murdered, and a military general named Huerta took the reins of power. Millions of Mexicans fleeing the chaos poured into the United States across the border, and Wilson, of course, was faced with a dilemma. he's a pacifist, he's an idealist, the world ought not to behave this way. So what do I do now? Well, of course, he did what any idealist would do, and he tried to sidestep it, to get around the problem without direct intervention. When U.S. sailors were captured, he finally did intervene and seized the port of Veracruz. Not a full-scale act of war, but nonetheless an effort to show that he was trying to monitor and control the situation. Fortunately for the United States, though, the Western Hemispheric powers at the time, they were called the ABC powers, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, came to the rescue. The United States and Mexico were on the border, on the brink of war, and these three South American nations intervened, stepped in. Huerta stepped down and was replaced by President Carranza. That didn't stop everything. Pancho Villa was perhaps the insurgent of the day, the Emilio Aguinaldo of Mexico, and harassed the United States military at every turn, and led a small-scale bandidos revolution against the U.S. military. Ultimately, General Pershing, who would later gain fame in World War I, was able to subdue the insurgency. The bottom line was we avoided war with Mexico, and Wilson could dodge the bullet there, pun intended, I guess, and do what he did not want to do, or do what he wanted to do, which was avoid war. However, as you'll recall from last year, on the horizon in 1914 was looming World War I, and this was going to be a war that, as try as he might, Wilson was not going to be able to avoid the conflict. Let's do a quick review, of course. Thanks to the tensions of imperialism, the rising militaristic behaviors of many European nations, the formations of alliances, Europe was a powder keg, and all it needed was a spark. And that spark came in the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. And with that assassination, the armies began to roll, and Europe immediately was embroiled in a massive conflict. The United States, of course, immediately proclaimed, we're not involved in this, this is your fight over there. And I'll use that term purposefully, over there. There's actually a song of that same title that was popular in the 19-teens here in the United States that really just did get at the heart of the matter, which was, that's over there. We're over here. The world is separated by two great oceans, and we're on the right side and they're on the burning side, and frankly, let them burn. So we declared our neutrality, although when you look at that neutrality, you'll begin to realize that it wasn't exactly perfectly neutral. In fact, the United States had very strong anti-German sentiments, and we were doing incredible trade with the Allies, specifically Great Britain. We were making a lot of money off the early years of the war, loaning money to the Allies, lending them supplies, doing business with them, and banks were profiting in a remarkable way despite our so-called neutrality. We'll get into part 2 here in the next video.